So, after Whitman published his 1855 edition of Leaves of Grass, containing 95 poems, the most famous of which, of course, is Song of Myself, other notable poems from the first edition would be The Sleepers and I Sing the Body Electric. After he published the book, self published as we know, he wrote some reviews of his own work anonymously. There's Walt Whitman, the showman, the Walt Whitman that reminds us as much as P.T. Barnum as Ralph Waldo Emerson. But in addition to writing good reviews of his own book, he, of course, received the wonderful letter from Ralph Waldo Emerson. And immediately he released a second edition in 1856 of Song of Myself, on which he pasted the letter from Emerson as a detailed blurb. He did this without Emerson's permission. Emerson probably didn't like this very much. This edition was much expanded from the first, many more poems. Probably the most notable poem of the expansion would be Crossing Brooklyn Ferry. So between 1856 and 1860, when the third edition was published, Whitman shifts in attitude. Many scholars imagine Whitman's writing career falling into three phases. Now, these phases are a little too neat for my taste, but they're useful for getting a basic grasp of shifts in Whitman's verse. 1855 to 1859, you have the Whitman of Song of Myself, open, free, celebratory, embracing, suggesting that ultimately there is no tragedy, there is no death, because what is death but the uncut hair of graves? Life is always overcoming death. But then, as we will see when we look at Out of the Cradle Endlessly Rocking and As I Ebb with the Oceans of Life, and also when we look at the Calamus poems and the Children of Adam poems, we'll see that Whitman, probably around 1859, started exploring a darker vision in his verse. He started creating a persona that was full of doubt, confusion, what we would call depression, and he explores death and loss and unfulfilled desire. And this period runs from about 1859 to the end of the Civil War, which would be 1865, which Whitman crowns with what many think is his greatest poem, his elegy to Abraham Lincoln, When Lilacs Last and Adore Are Bloomed. Then in 1866, Whitman starts the third phase, some think, where he's still very attuned to death and loss, but starts looking toward the future, starts looking toward immortality. Passage to India would be an exemplary poem of this period. But what I want to talk about in this lecture is the two poems that mark this shift into phase two most markedly. And those poems would be Out of the Cradle Endlessly Rocking and As I Ebb with the Ocean of Life. Both poems were published in 1859, published in periodicals. What's going on with Whitman at this time in his life? Many suppose that Whitman was suffering some kind of crisis at this time. We don't know what it might have been, but clearly something happened to push him from this freewheeling celebration of everything to this sense of limitation and confusion. Now, we don't want to reduce poetry to biography, but we can imagine that some shift took place. Some say, well, he lost his job as the editor of the Brooklyn Times, and this hurt his confidence. Maybe some say that his first two editions of the poem were not doing as well critically and commercially as he wanted. Maybe some say that he was becoming increasingly disgruntled with the events of the nation. As noted, he was an abolitionist. He was very concerned over the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. He could see that the country was going to fall asunder soon. And this great poet of unity, poet as unifier, the fact that the country would fall asunder was very upsetting to him, perhaps. Some even speculate that he had a sexual crisis. He was writing around this time the Calamus poems, which are about man, male love. They do have a homoerotic tinge to them, and many speculate that Whitman was homosexual at a time when that sort of behavior would not have been acceptable like it is now for the most part. Um, but we don't know. The point is that in these two poems, Out of the Cradle, Endlessly Rocking as the Evolution of Life, these are crisis poems, regardless of what the origin of the crisis is. In Out of the Cradle, Endlessly Rocking, we have the adult poet imagining himself as a child poet walking on the seashore and enjoying the presence of two birds. But at a certain point, the female bird disappears, maybe killed. And so the young boy imagines what the he bird must feel, what sorrow, what anguish, what loss. And he translates the bird song into human song. As he says, I walked on the ocean front, peering, absorbing, translating, looking intensely, and translating natural phenomena into human symbols. And what he learns from the bird that he is, of course, describing, is that the origin of song is not exuberance. The origin of poetry is not affirmation. It's the opposite. That the young boy, for the first time, senses that death is part of the world, that loss is part of the world. And he says, from this point on, as I hear that bird sing, I will sing of the sweet hell within, the sweet hell within. I will sing of what is most painful. I will sing of unsatisfied desire. I will sing of death. So suddenly, Whitman becomes a poet of tragedy and says that, basically, to quote Wallace Stevens, death is the mother of beauty. That that sense of incompletion, that sense of loss, that sense of the world not giving you what you want. That's precisely what inspires poetry, which expresses the pain, it mourns, but also in mourning, it can find symbols, rhythms, rituals that give the pain some kind of meaning. So, Out of the Cradle ends in a fairly affirmative way, as dark as it is. That is not so true with As I Ebb with the Ocean of Life, where the poet says, I have an electric self, but he's unable to translate all the flotsam and jetsam and debris he sees on the seashore. It's friable, it's dead, and he's trying to translate all that material into something meaningful, as he translated the bird song into something meaningful and Out of the Cradle. But he's unable to do so. And he says, and this just feels so strange coming from Walt Whitman. The Walt Whitman who in 1855 could say, I celebrate myself, and what I assume you shall assume, for every atom belongs to me as good belongs to you. Says 4 years later, I perceive I have not really understood anything, not a single object, and that no man ever can. Nature here in sight of the sea taking advantage of me to dart upon me and sting me, because I have dared to open my mouth to sing at all. I haven't perceived anything. I've not understood anything. No one can understand anything. How dare I even open my mouth to sing? I know so little. Interestingly, that poem ends with the poet, unable to find any kind of sympathy with the objects around him, imagines future readers like ourselves reading the poem, and perhaps reading the poem sympathetically. And that becomes a way for him to imagine himself at least out of his pain, moving out of self to other, or at least an imagined other. So these poems do mark the transition to the darker Whitman that we'll see in the Calamus poems, that we'll see in the Children of Adam, and also that we'll see most prominently in the Civil War poems that we'll turn to before too long.